So welcome everybody to another episode of the Ripple Intent Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Kyle Makowski, and with me as always is Jon Grant. Jon, please say hello.
Hey listeners, great to have you again.
Great to have you indeed. We are dead in the middle of summer here, but what's really fascinating is our guest is not. I have been following this guy online for, my gosh, probably 6-7 years, and one of his things popped up the other day, and I was listening to it, and I was reading about it, and I was like, I wonder if he'd be interested. And then I was looking at his website, and I'm like, there's no way he'd be interested in our little podcast here at Ripple Intent. And so I reached out, and no surprise, within a few seconds, he wrote back. He was like, sure, let's do it. And I was like, okay, here we go. So I'm very excited to have you here, Colin. Our guest today is Colin Ellis, and I'll let him give a little bit of introduction about who he is, what he does, where he's from, and we'll go from there. So thank you, Colin, for being here. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Kyle. Obviously, the $50,000 also helped for this appearance. So thank you for that. So yeah, where am I? I'm in the dead of winter at the minute. So I'm very obviously British and spent kind of my formative years till my late 30s in the UK. Then I got offered a job in New Zealand in 2007. So my wife, my young family, we moved there. And yeah, for the last 11 years, I've been in Australia where, people said it's warmer, but it turns out it's absolutely freezing in Melbourne in the winter. So a lot of my work is back in Europe. So I'm kind of shuttling between summer and winter and summer and winter, which is great for me, but not for everybody else when I'm sending pictures home.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. And I will confess, I had to go online to find a time zone calculator, like side-by-side calculator, to figure out when we can actually do this and how to make this work. So here we are. But it all worked out. So yeah, I mean, what caught my eye, and I know, Jon, we've talked about Colin here quite a bit and getting ready for our conversation today. What caught my eye, Colin, and always has, is you are just, everything that you do is centers around, it seems, culture. And in my mind, you're one of the experts that I go to try to get information, learn snippets, that kind of thing. And where your journey has taken you is obviously through a passionate journey. And so if you wouldn't mind, just how did you get into the culture business?
Yeah, through good, hard, honest work, Kyle. I was an employee for nearly 30 years. I think, when I look at the world, I'll come back to a little bit more of the story in a minute. But when I look at the world of self-help, self-development, there's loads of academics out there. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that's a good thing. People like Adam Grant, people like Brene Brown, they've got a background in research and academia. And, when I was a manager myself, what I used to look for was people like me, who's out there, who's been there, who's done that, who's worked in a bullying kind of environment, who's found it really hard to motivate certain people, maybe different ages, different backgrounds. And that was my journey. And there was no one really, Kyle, that I could find, or there's no books that I could find that were written by people. And so that's just a little bit of background, because I had this, we would call it curiosity now. We never used to call it curiosity, but I had this relentless desire to get better as a manager. I wanted my teams always to achieve. I became a manager kind of age 27, managing year 2000 projects. I was managing software developers. I wasn't really a technical guy, as it probably come across in the podcast. And so I had to learn really, really quickly on the job about how to build great teams. And, kind of fast forward through my career, as a manager in the private sector in the UK, then a senior director in government in New Zealand, and then Australia. And building teams was my passion. I worked a lot in the project world. Our job was really to build really, really great teams, get products delivered, get them implemented, celebrate the success, move on to the next thing. And so I was really passionate about this, and I got passed over for a C-suite job. I always thought that I could do a really great job as kind of like a chief information officer, or a chief commercial officer, whatever it was. But I got passed over for the first one that I went for, and I just decided that I would do the thing that I was looking for. And that would be to create this really simple, easy to follow narrative on how to build great culture. We never talked about never called it culture when I first started in 2013, 14. And so that's been my pathway ever since, and I haven't wavered from that, Kyle. The first few years working for myself were rough. As they always are when you don't know anybody and you're doing something that no one really wants. But I think, people are really switched on now. The world has changed, especially post-COVID, and people are actually interested in culture now. So, I mean, that's a kind of potted history. I've written 4 best-selling books. I've got another one coming out in August. Hopefully that does the same. And, my goal is to help individuals and organizations transform the way they get work done through simple, practical, easy to follow approaches.
All right, we've got to dive into that because, first of all, everyone talks about it, and it's really easy to talk about. I think Jon and I have heard over the years an increase of, okay, we have a good culture, whether it's team-based or organization-based. People talk about, we got to have a good culture. It's all about a culture. Come work here because we have a great culture. And then you find out there's the culture that they tell everybody, the public-facing culture, there's the real culture, and then there's the shadow culture, or the culture that exists behind. Yeah, so it is something that I think is overly talked about and simplified. Some of your work, you do simplify it, but it is an extremely complex topic.
It can be, Kyle. I don't think it is. I think we make it complicated so that we don't have to invest in it, which sounds really nefarious, but I think for some organizations that's true. Often you'll hear culture change is really hard. Well, if you don't teach people how to do it, of course it's going to be really hard. We don't teach people about culture. When you become a manager, we don't give you the basic managerial skills. We just expect that you'll just know how to do it. And a big part of that is creating a team. And actually, when you actually break it down, and so when I wrote Culture Fix in 2019. So I looked at these cultures all around the world, Kyle, and I was like, okay, well, what are the similarities between all of these great cultures? And when I look at where cultures went wrong, where did they go wrong? And there's essentially six things in every culture, right? There's at the heart of every great culture, there's a vision and a purpose, right? So it's either vision or purpose. Purpose has become more prevalent in the last 3 years, different generational requirements. There's a set of values. Most people are really bad at those. Then there's the personalities that work within the culture and how they communicate to each other. So personality and communication is 3. Then there's behavior 4, collaboration 5, innovation 6. And they are the, what I would call the 6 pillars of culture. But there's an assumption that everybody knows what they are, how to do them. Collaboration is a great example. Is people often talk about things like silos, which is just broken subcultures, and they just don't know how to work together. But actually, if you spend some time making some agreements, that becomes easier to do. And so I think you talked a little bit about the shadow culture. I think the shadow culture often is this little black box that we don't put out into the world, but actually that's coming more out into the world through social media. People are talking about it a little bit more. So I suppose just to sum that little point up is if you don't teach people what culture is and how to do it, then it's always going to be hard. Whereas when we educate people, all of a sudden it becomes easier, and we're like, oh, there is a magic formula after all.
Yeah, I feel like there's always going to be a culture in the team. Maybe it's the one you want, but if you're not intentional about it, it could be whatever you get, right? So you could get lucky, and it's a great team. Maybe you're not so lucky, and we fall apart on all 6 of the pillars.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on, Jon. So you get the culture that you choose to build, right? And so the best cultures in the world, so, Cisco, a client of mine, they're in the top 1, 2, 3 every year. They actively build culture every year. They're intentional about it. I remember working with a client once, and I said, tell me about when it was really, really great. And, he explained there was they had a crisis that happened, and then everybody pulled together. He's like, I just want to bottle that. I'm like, well, you can do, because you can just define what that looks like in advance. And then you've always got this North Star that people will come back to. 99% of organizations don't do that, Jon. So they're not intentional about culture build. So more often than not, it is luck. And so, you get the culture that you choose to build. So if you do no work on culture whatsoever, then it's just going to be a stagnant swamp of a place to work, You're just going to dread going in every day. If you're focused on harmony and family, which is good to a point, but not necessarily for getting stuff done, you end up with like a pleasant culture. If you let a few kind of real direct bullying types rule the roost, then you get what I call a combatant culture, where everything's a bit of a fight, everything's a bit of a battle. But actually, when you involve people in defining what it means to work here, how we're going to behave together, how we're going to work together, how we're going to use technology to support the work that we do, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, then you get a vibrant culture. And if you choose to do that, then that's what you get. But you're absolutely right. Not enough organizations are intentional about it.
I remember once when we talked about we were going to build a very large building, and we were pulling people together, and I asked for a couple months of team building in order to align the core group of people so that we could do a lot of what you're talking about. And somebody looked at me and said, "We just hired very professional companies who have built a lot of buildings. Why would we do this?" And I didn't have a response at the time. I mean, my default response was, why wouldn't we? But I learned in that moment many years ago that the expectation was, like you said with the manager, you should know how to do this. Why would we even bother to spend time talking about this? And I love your point too about the shadow piece, that through social media and other mechanisms, we're losing the ability to hide how companies actually behave internally.
That's right. Yeah, and that's a good thing. Just interesting, someone who worked in a lot of projects, and I still work with project teams now, Kyle, to help them build the team before they start the work. When I was in project management, so even back in 2007, I had this, kind of approach: as you build a team, you build the plan, then you deliver the project. It's always in that order. And I remember I was a program director for a big technology program in New Zealand. We were working with a team of guys in India. And I said to my boss then, who was the chief executive, I said, "We've got to fly these guys in." And he was like, "Yeah, that's not what we do." I'm like, "What do you mean it's not what we do?" He's like, "Well, that's not what we do. We don't do that kind of thing." It's like, if you want a successful project, we need to meet these people. We need to interact with them. We need to get to know them. We need to set the ground rules. We need to set the team norms. We need to understand how we're going to work together. Just because they're great people doesn't happen by chance. And I think that's still the expectation. We've got great people in the roles, therefore we get a great culture. No, that's not the way that culture works. You get the culture you choose to build. And interestingly, we flew these guys in from India, and it cost a lot of money, but actually it saved us a lot of money further down the track because we had the relationships. So when anything ever went wrong, we were still able to stay on track. Everything went like clockwork. We had to produce a business case. We sent that to the government minister in advance of the deadline. He was like, "This is brilliant." It's like, yeah, you build a team, then you build a plan, and then you deliver the project. Who knew that would work?
How do you run into much resistance with that?
All the time. Yeah. Sorry, Kyle, you finish.
No. I love it. You're like, of course, all the time. How do you?
All the time. Yeah.
I'm only asking because we run into it every day.
And bear in mind, as an author and as a public speaker and as a culture consultant, I've got all of the statistics. I've got all of the research to prove that actually, if you do it properly, you get all of it. You get increases in productivity, engagement, but sense of belonging, increases in well-being, increases in quality. You get all of these things. And yet I still come up to people and culture managers go, yeah, we can't afford to do that. I was like, you can't afford not to do it. Did you not just hear all of those statistics? Well, it's just not the way that we do things. And often, because, I've worked with a lot of technology companies and a lot of engineering companies, and you think they'd be the people that wouldn't do it because they're less focused, kind of generally on the emotional side of things, because culture can be quite emotional. And yet I find they're the people that really value it the most, because it's not something that comes natural. So all of a sudden, when they create these conditions, it's like, okay, well, we've done something that was just a little bit outside of our comfort zone. Now we see how we can leverage it to get the results that we're looking for. But the resistance is there. But I think it will change, Kyle. When I first set out, when I started doing this, it was 2014. I quit my job after getting passed over. for a C-suite job. And listen, we had no money as a family, we had no asset, we had nothing. We had a couple of young kids, and I was like, I just think there's a future in this thing called culture. And of course, no one wanted a bar of it for 2 years. I had to take contracts to keep the money coming in. And then all of a sudden, kind of around about 2017, this was when we had millennials coming into management positions. All of a sudden, there was a bit of a sea change. And people were like, oh, hang on a minute. What I know is when I was happiest is when we actually took the time to build a team. And so all of a sudden we had this generational kind of shift. And to the point now where people are starting to value it. There's some really interesting research recently where 92% of CEOs said they now see the value in culture, building culture, but only 16% say they are where they need to be right now. So you've got this chasm between 92% and 16%. And I think that 16 will grow. I hope so, for my family's sake, that will continue to grow over the years as more and more people see the value in building culture.
Jon, I just want to point out, I love that you keep saying build the culture. In construction, you say build the team. And in construction, I feel like we assemble the team. And it's a subtle difference, but that's a key difference, I think, in how much time we actually pay attention to this when we get, these different organizations together to, complete, deliver a project and build something. And, same thing inside our organizations, right? It's just that building component is such a different animal that needs more attention. I also just want to point out, I really love, that was very polite how you said that engineering firms are, less inclined towards emotions.
Yeah.
That was very nice of you. It's not that we don't feel. We just don't want you to know that we feel.
This turned into a therapy session for you, Jon.
We don't want to know ourselves that we feel. Speaking for engineers across the world, you're all welcome.
We joke about it. There's a serious point here, because for decades, and I mean for decades, culture was seen as fluffy. It was seen as too emotional, and I still think people get it wrong because they do too much of the emotional stuff, right? And there's the best cultures have a real mix between connecting human beings, generating self-awareness, ensuring that strong relationships exist, and just getting the job done. And making sure that there's discipline, and making sure that we don't waste time, and making sure that we don't tolerate brilliant jerks, people whose attitudes stink, who are technically good at their job. And cultures are a real mix of these things. And I think that the narrative often, and you said it, Jon, and it's so true, is that language is so important. I think the reason that my kind of culture programs are so popular is because I say it how it is, and I don't mean that I'm confrontational. I just use language that people are familiar with. A few years ago, there was a real pushback on radical candor, and people were sending people on radical candor courses. And like this guy said to me, he's like, the problem I've got is I have no idea what that means. I was like, it's just courageous feedback. He was like, why don't they call it that then? Why do they have to call it fancy words? And I think it's a barrier for culture, is that people just don't get the fancy stuff. So just say what it is. It's about people, exactly as you said, Jon, Kyle, at the start, it's about people getting to know each other, finding ways to work together such that we can feel good about who we are as individuals. We get the job done so that collectively we all succeed. Who doesn't want that?
Right. Okay, so to your point of making it practical and simpler, I want to be respectful. I really would love for you to talk about the blueprint, right? Your culture blueprint and the 4 steps. One of the reasons, I'm really fascinated by it, by the way, and I know this is a months-long conversation, right, that we really could have, but we've only got a short time today. What I'm really curious about, because I don't see a lot of people talking about it, is step 4 with impact and the measurement component. And so I'd love if you could maybe just kind of walk us through the 4 steps. Let's give them all respect and share with the audience so they understand a little bit more. But I'd love to kind of deep dive into that, because I really feel like that's where a lot of us fall down, and that's where everything just goes to crap.
Yeah, it does. So the 4 steps, and I do these free calls, and not that many people take it. You'd be amazed. Like, I'm like, here's a global culture expert who's going to give you 40 minutes. Because I think maybe people fear that it's a sales pitch, and it's not really that. There's a little bit of that. Let's be honest, I work for myself. But I really want to help people to get better at this stuff. I want them to create the conditions where people feel like they're succeeding. So there's 4 steps, and the first step is intention. So this is really about making sure that there's commitment from the leaders to do the right things in the right way. I think, Kyle, you mentioned this at the start, is there's lots of lip service paid to culture. It's a word that everybody uses. We want a good culture. Oh, we need a good culture. People used to say to me, oh, we want a Netflix culture. Never going to get a Netflix culture, because at least 2 people in this room don't want to spend any money on culture, and everyone's looking around going, who are the 2 people? I always know who they are. You can spot them a mile off. They're usually on their phones. So you've got to make sure, because what you need from leaders is they need to role model the culture to everybody else. So without that commitment, you're kind of screwed, really. Without that intention, without them showing that intention that this means something to us, then without that, then forget it. The second step is knowledge. So this is making sure that the people who have the greatest impact on culture, which is your middle managers, they have the knowledge of what culture actually is and how to do it really, really well. I wrote a blog a few weeks ago. Like, I'm done with these complex leadership development programs where the magic few get to go on these leadership development programs, and then they measure them by how much they enjoyed them rather than the change that they've seen actually in results, which is just a nonsense. You've got a load of managers who are like, hello, it would be nice if we had the skills to do the job. You're putting all this pressure on me, but I'd like to know. So making sure that the middle managers have got that knowledge, right? So I think that's crucially important. The third step is action. Is what do you currently do with regards to culture? Have you got a vision? Great. Have you got a set of values? If so, what do you do with them? How do you put them into action? What are your behaviors like? We're only ever as good as the behavior that we choose to walk past, so how are we demonstrating culture at the minute? And then, kind of what do we want it to look like? What do we want it to feel like? And, different people have different things. And then the step 4, which is the bit, John, that you mentioned, is what's the impact of it? And you're so right. Is that often what people want is the impact. They want step 4 without doing 1, 2, 3. So often what you'll hear is I'll speak to a CFO or a CEO, and they'll say, all right, so we've heard you do this culture stuff. I'm like, great. Okay. When can we expect results? I'm like, well, it really depends on the commitment that you show, the knowledge your managers demonstrate, and how keen you are to put what you agree into action. And at that point, they're just like, yeah, we're not interested. We just wanted you to say we will get this much revenue in a month. It takes 3-6 months. But that impact is crucial, because you will get if you actually do steps 1, 2, and 3, you will get 4. I've seen it happen in 3 months. I've seen it happening. There's a team I work with. It happened for them in 7 months, and their sales went up 30% in 7 months. And kind of really understanding the impact of culture really then provides that justification for doing all the work in the first place. And that's when people are sold and they're like, now we get it. But geez, it takes a lot of effort to get there.
So what else are like the measurement? I mean, are we just talking like sales, revenue? Like, what else is there? I mean, are there other qualitative things that you look at that you're encouraging teams to measure?
Yeah, so every time I do a program, John, I want people, I always encourage measurement. And somebody called me the anti-consultant. Is like, wait a minute, you give all your knowledge away and you want us to measure what you do. That's not how consultancy works. I'm like, oh, okay, I think that's a compliment. That's good. So you can, the best measurement of culture is how happy people are, right? That's the best measurement. In most organizations, they'll do like an engagement survey. And engagement is just about how much you care. I always say this. Engagement is how much you care. How much do you care about your job? How much do you care about the people around you? How much do you care about your targets you've got to hit? How much do you care about what the organization's trying to do? But for me, how happy do people feel in their jobs? Because, culture essentially is the daily lived experience of employees. That's what culture is. So how happy people are. But then you can also measure, did we get an increase in sales? Did our attrition rate go down? In other words, we're able to keep more of the people that we want to keep. How many people are we performance managing? For any high performing organization, they're generally performance managing between 3 to 5% of the workforce, because there's always going to be that idiot who wants to hold everybody back. There's usually always 1 or 2 people in the team. And so how are we kind of making sure that they don't ruin it for everybody else? Are we able to hire the people that we want to hire? Are we able to attract people? My biggest client is Red Bull, the energy drink, and they've got a queue of people just waiting to join them. Literally waiting. They know that if they approach someone, that people will want to work for them because of the culture that they built, fewer quality defects. And so there's so many measures that you can use, John, but typically HR just go for, well, let's just measure engagement. And, I'm not saying that's wrong. That's fine. But actually there's way more, kind of qualitative and quantitative measures that you can use to demonstrate just the value of working on your culture.
What's the connection or the disconnection between culture and engagement? And the reason I ask is, so we do a lot of work with Strength Finders, the one assessment from the Gallup organization, and we use their statistics quite often, which are also they're pretty sobering. They're sad to know that 7 out of 10 people really just don't care about the job that they have, and that's unfortunate, because just like you, we'll point out in the room, well, there's 30 people in the room, so you guys do the math. And yeah, there are half the people are just along for the ride. 3 out of 10 are actually interested and engaged. But that's the best we got, because like you said, still the perception is measuring culture is kind of fluffy and light and soft, and it's not real tangible. But we can go back to over here where we have hardcore metrics to show where he invested in X and we got Y, and yay us, we're so smart.
Yeah, so the engagement thing's a really interesting one, Kyle. If we've got a high level of active disengagement, then it's really down to the company to change the conditions. They don't see it that way. They'll just put it down to intrinsic motivation. In other words, Kyle, you need to fix your attitude when you come into work. That they'll put it on you to do that, rather than them creating the conditions where actually you feel more engaged coming to work. And again, I'm an optimistic realist. I would say that 100% of employees would choose not to go to work if they had the money in the bank that meant they didn't have to do it. All right, maybe 95%. All right, there's some people that just love their jobs, right? I love my job, but I still want to do it. So optimistic really. So people have to come to work. So how about we create the conditions where it actually becomes more pleasurable to come to work? And then we put the emphasis on helping people to better understand themselves. So you use Strengths Finders. So that's okay. It's a way of connecting people. It gives us a common language. But also, what are you doing to develop yourself? What are you doing to contribute? I'm not a big fan of people who just want to come and tread water. Treading water is just like, I'm just going to stay in the same place. I'm just going to keep doing the same thing up and down, left and right. That's fine. You have to be a good human being. And in other words, you have to, be able to have conversations with people. You have to join in with stuff. You might have to do the odd social event every now and again. And you have to be a good teammate. You have to push yourself. You have to, be 5% outside of your comfort zone to get the best out of the people around you. You have to challenge where you feel it's necessary to challenge. And you have to really care about the target that you've got. And if you don't do that, then there has to be a pathway for performance management. But it's very hard to performance manage people if you haven't actually spent the time and the money, Kyle, to create the environment to generate engagement. And this is where organizations fall down all of the time. And so every organization I've worked with over the past 7 years and helped them to define their culture. Once you've defined your culture, all of a sudden you've got a brand new standard to which to hold people to, and they feel it straight away. And the engagement goes up immediately because they're like, okay, wow, we've never done anything like this before. And now we feel a different sense of responsibility for owning and protecting this thing that we've created. And then it's up to the middle managers to make sure that people kind of stay aligned to that.
I want to ask another question on this, but I also don't want to forget, because you got a book coming out and we want to talk about that.
Okay.
In that scenario, so this happens in our world a lot. Being in the project world, you understand this. Some people work on projects for a couple of years on the same project, and they form their own, call it a small company, because that project is really the only thing that's so big, it's so massive. It's what they do. They go through this, they live it, they create an intentional culture. And then when that project's over, they go back to their organization. And it's almost like the hero's journey, because they come back and they're like, guess what I did? And they're like, we don't do that here. You need to reassimilate or move on. Well, what insights do you have for those people who experience that, kind of see the light or feel or experience something where it's like, wow, work could be so much better, but then they go back to the machine where they're told, nope, not going to do that?
Well, it's so hard, and that speaks a lot to my kind of early career, I suppose, as a manager. I was a project manager, build a team, build a plan, deliver the project. I did that for 5-6 years. And then I would go back and say, okay, well, here's something that we did. Let's replicate this here. And the answer was always no. I was seen as a bit of a maverick because I did things differently. Not bad, I always conformed to rules, regulations, all of these kinds of things. And so what I then started to do, and my recommendation for people who are in the same position is to start to use your influence in small ways. So become a role model for difference. So a great example of this, when I first moved to New Zealand in 2007, I worked for an electrical engineering company. It was a government department, a state-owned enterprise in New Zealand. Fabulous organization. I had a great boss. We had some great people around me. But I just did some things differently, things that I'd taken from my previous private sector role. So, for example, everyone had a BlackBerry. Remember BlackBerries when they were a thing? Everyone had a BlackBerry. Everyone carried around with them everywhere. But I didn't carry mine around with me because even then in 2007, I was like, this is just a distraction. There was a flashing green light on the top, I remember. And I bought a fruit bowl because I was sick of people looking at their BlackBerries. And I'm like, I'm not going to allow this in my meetings, right? So I bought a fruit bowl and everyone had to put their BlackBerry in. And so that was one thing that I did. The second thing that I did was, I didn't send emails and I didn't copy people into emails. Well, in government, that was just unheard of then. People were like, what? I remember one boss saying to me, he was like, how is it I get 100 emails a day and I look at your inbox and there's nothing in it? I was like, Tim, how many emails do you send a day? He was like, I don't know, 50. I was like, there you go. I send about 3. And so there are ways to take what you've done and take what you've learned and to slowly influence people. Don't come back and go, we need to change this and change this and change this. You just carry on doing some of those things that you did. And slowly what happens, and certainly what happened with me, is people start to copy it. And they're like, okay, well, that's pretty cool. Like, I was used to put my out of office on, and my out of office message was, thanks so much for your email. I'm currently on vacation. As a result, this email has been deleted. It's not that it's not important to me. I just don't want to waste time when I come back reading 500 emails. I'll keep the first 3 days free. If it's important, come and see me. And like one person would come and see me. And I'm like, there you go, justified that. So it's little things like that you can do to really start to influence the way that people work.
I remember that exactly. I came back from one of my very first, 2-week vacations, and I didn't even look at the computer the first day. I just walked around the office and talked to everybody. And then I did it the second day. And then I sat down and started going through the email, and I realized I don't have to read any of this stuff.
That's right.
It's all old news. I caught up. We're great.
Well, the analogy I use, Kyle, is when you come back, let's say you go away for 2 weeks on vacation. When you come back, have you got 2 weeks worth of the newspapers? And do you then go and read it all to see what happened in the 2 weeks you're on? No one ever does that. Crazy.
Right? That's awesome. So before we go, let's talk about this because you've written a ton of books and you've got another one coming out. So let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, just briefly, Detox Your Culture, which will be out at the end of August. So toxic culture is the biggest risk to organizations now. This is not 10 years ago where you could have really bad working conditions and no one would ever see it. If you've got really poor working conditions now, people are going to talk and they're going to tell the media, they're going to put it on social media. And so, I spent a very depressing 18 months reading some of the most horrific stories possible about toxic cultures. Again, because I don't want organizations to find themselves in the position where they got one. I want to help them to understand what they need to do to avoid some of the scenarios that I've read about. And so that's what I've done. Again, it's a real practical guide on how can you, and the best way to detoxify your culture is to make sure that the conditions for toxicity are never there in the first place. So that's the goal, is to give them this practical sense of, if you do these things, then you won't get that at the end.
How do most of those toxic cultures form? Is it because someone goes in there with intention, like, I'm going to really screw this place up? Or is it like John was talking, you were talking earlier about this, just more blind luck? What's the path that leads people down to a toxic culture?
So certainly in my experience, nobody wants to come into work and be the worst version of themselves. I think what happens is that somebody will demonstrate a poor behavior, get away with it, and then just assume that that's okay. And then it's on the organization to hold that person to account, and they never do. What you generally find is there are one or two individuals. In the majority of the cases that I read, there are one or two individuals that behave absolutely appallingly towards other human beings, and their company lets them get away with it, either because they're afraid of how it may play out in the media. The person is a senior person, and that happens a lot. Or the fact that, they just don't understand how to actually change or how to actually stop it. So they become paralyzed. And then it just festers and festers and festers, and they hope it will go away. And it never does, Cal. It just gets worse and worse and worse. And then if you get to the point where you have a toxic culture, you're looking at 18 months to 2 years, and that's if your business survives. There was an example of an organization called the Confederation of British Industry in the UK. It practically broke them as a business because they allowed one senior member of staff just to behave in the most appalling way. And they're only just now getting back on their feet, and that's 2 years later.
Yeah, I want to go back because you said something that I got to know. Have you always believed this? Did this develop over time? You said that you believe that people don't want to come to work and be the worst version of themselves. And what I hear that is most people, or people in general, want to show up and do good work. They want to feel like they contribute. They want to feel like they matter, and they would go home, feel like they fulfilled. So that means that most people show up with good intention. Have you always believed that, or is that something that formed, or has it been reinforced? Like where did that come from?
Yeah, I've always believed that, Kyle. And I think that it stems from my experience at school. Again, not to turn this into a therapy session, but I didn't have the best experience at school. You're taught in a very particular way. It's literally by the book, because there are teaching standards and all these kinds of things. So I didn't, I left school, early without any real qualifications. But I knew that I was trying to be the best of me in school, but it just wasn't happening for whatever reason. When I started to work, I was surrounded by people who I noticed a real difference when you were positive towards them. And I'm not talking about telling them to be positive. It's just this, if you can project positivity, if you can project that sense of optimism, I always think if you believe the best of people, then that's what you'll get. But the same is also true if you believe the worst of people. So, the former is always better. And I think most people, I would say 99% of people, when they get up in the morning, what they want to do, because they know they have to work to get the money so they can do the things that they enjoy in life. What they want is to go in, not be overwhelmed by what they consider to be administrative tasks like emails and back-to-back meetings and all these kind of things. They just want time to do their job, to interact with people in a very human way, but not overdo it because it gets in the way of work. Get to the end of the day feeling fulfilled, not completely spent, and then talk positively about the difference that they've made. And I think that, I teach this to people now, and I feel privileged to teach people this now, is if you can do that, all you're going to do is generate happiness. You're going to generate loyalty, commitment, and a real desire to improve. And I think, most people, that's all they want. They just want to be recognized for doing good work, being a good human being, to earn the money so that they can do the things they love in life.
So true. Jon, what's on your mind before we wrap up? I know there's a million things, but pick one.
So this is a deep cut. 10 minutes ago, you said Kyle needed to change his attitude at work. That's my takeaway.
Yeah, I was just acknowledging the email that you sent me in advance of this podcast, Jon. Just get this in somewhere. Make sure it doesn't look obvious.
It's perfect.
I love email. I don't know why there's so aversion to email. Oh my gosh. No, Colin, this is fascinating. I mean, I could really have this conversation with you all day long. I love your spin, and that whole idea of making culture digestible and easier for people to understand and implement. It doesn't have to be this big emotional, unknown, this intangible entity. It's manageable. And I love that. We talk about that in our different events with Ripple Intent and going through, and it's still, that's hard for people to wrap their heads around, that it doesn't have to be this weirdo anomaly thing. It's going to happen. So if you're intentional about it and you follow a couple of steps in making your way through, you can get what you're looking for and get a lot more fulfillment and enjoyment out of going to work, as long as we still have to go to work.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right, Jon. I think most people just want an opportunity to have a say in the conditions are created. Very, very quickly, I did a workshop for 330 engineers, right, who just naturally, they'd just rather be out in the field. This is what they did. They fixed electricity lines on poles, but their culture wasn't particularly good. And I had one engineer come up to me at the start, and he's like, "Oh, you, Colin, you're the facilitator." I was like, "Yeah," completely disarmed me. He just said, "I just want you to know, I hate this kind of thing." That was his opening gambit of this 2-day workshop. I was like, right, okay. That's good. At the end of the 2 days, I'm not sure whether can I swear on the podcast? I'm not sure. All right. I'll keep it. I'll tone it down. And I said to him at the end of the day, I was like, did you enjoy it? He just said it was the least worst thing I've ever done. And I'm like, I'll take it. And then I saw him again 3 months later, and he said, I have to be honest. He's like, it made such a difference. I was like, but I'm not doing the work. I'm just asking you how it is. You guys are actually doing the work now. All I did was run a workshop so that you could agree how you want to do things together. He was like, yeah, he said, I get that now. He's like, but at the start, he's like, I've been so used to people telling me what the culture of the team is. He's like, now I realize that everyone gets a say in culture. It's all our responsibility. And actually, if we make the time to make it good, then that's what it'll be. And I just thought that was such a great insight from someone who was naturally pushing back against this kind of activity.
Sure. Well, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised because, like you said in the beginning, the industry of whatever you want to call it, self-help or organizational dynamics or so forth, is chock full of misses. A lot of us, and Jon and I can attest to it too, and you probably experienced it too when you were working. Yeah. We hired us. And we experienced us and we went, this is not producing. This is not, for whatever reason, hitting the mark. And we can do better. And it turns out, instead of going and finding the person who can do better, you just said, well, I can do better. And here you are. So that's awesome. It really is awesome. So yeah, the expectation is I'm going to sit through this song and dance and I'm going to go back to work. And instead, the experience that person had was obviously not just him, but others around him. It was meaningful enough that, like you said, you got them to actually do the work. So awesome, man. Like Jon said, we could keep going. We could talk for hours. I mean, it's awesome. Like I said in the beginning, your passion for this, it certainly comes through. Your energy is still unmatched. So thank you so much for joining us today. How do people find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn, Kyle, at Colin with one L, Ellis with two L's, or colindellis.com. Or you can just search Amazon for the books and you'll find me on there too.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. Appreciate you being here. For those of you listening, of course, on a Ripple Intent side, reach out to us, rippleintent.org. Find Jon and I on LinkedIn. Until next time, enjoy. Hope you had a good time, and we will see you on the next podcast. Take care.